Who do you work for?
I'm unemployed.
What is your social security number? And why did you come here?
I got your message about wanting to give Donkey Kong's Crash Course another shot.
You should have known that was a lie.
So what did you want from me?
Well, I just wanted to spread the good news.
This is just arms.
Yeah, video game consoles have existed since the dawn of man. Or the Magnavox Odyssey, pick your poison. Ever since then, many companies have risen to the occasion of trying to beat the absolute piss out of each other in terms of unit sales. Nowadays, there are only really 3 console producers that matter: Sony, Microsoft, and Nintendo. Can you tell which one I prefer?
Was that a question or a cry for help?
And from those companies arises a mutual spite. Each of them has their own strengths, gimmicks, and stupid diehard fans. But because of that, you might find a lot of people taking sides with these companies out of some sort of either lust or respect. It's really hard to tell sometimes. For example, whenever I meet someone who doesn't know what a GameCube is while touting an obnoxious retro PlayStation t-shirt, it takes more effort than you'd think to hold myself back. This is all because of the console wars, or my massive ego. These fights over whose consoles sold the most units are mostly just for show. Even if a company does a bit iffy during one generation, it's not like they don't have a few $billions in their back pocket. It would take a string of colossal failures and unfortunate events to throw a giant out of the console market. I'm pretty sure Sega looks in the mirror every day to try and figure out where it all went wrong. However, the console wars of today, while rather large, are nowhere near as cutthroat as they used to be. You might hear some debate among fans on which company they think is better, but rarely do you see the companies themselves trying to gun down the competition with malicious intent. As for how console wars were back in the earlier generations, all you need to do is watch a Sega Genesis ad to realize that, Jesus, these companies hated each other. Some of these companies would be absolutely ruthless with how they would show off to make anyone that isn't playing on their consoles look like a loser. Now, things are much more civil. Sega going from Nintendo's main rival during the 4th and 5th generations to one of their biggest supporters during the 6th and 7th generations is still something that keeps me up at night. I thought character development was a myth. It just goes to show that times change and we can all learn something from the consoles of the past so that we can apply that knowledge to the consoles of the future. Or maybe it just means that no one liked the Dreamcast. And for those reasons, I feel like it would be perfect to look back at the console wars of yesteryear and look at what each of them brought to the table in terms of technological feats as well as spite.
And then when you play Donkey Kong's Crash Course?
Yeah, when you start to care about the impact and legacy of the Nintendo 64 Rumble Pack. Behold, the first generation of video game consoles! They couldn't have even spared a tumbleweed. This isn't to say that there wasn't much going on during the first generation of video game consoles. On the contrary, this generation follows a great number of events and showcases of pent-up aggression, mostly over Pong. But it's just that not many people really cared about video games given that they were just starting to become a thing. This just means that the unit sales of the consoles of the first generation should be taken with a grain of salt, and should be seen as relatively successful, despite many of them selling less than the Virtual Boy. God, that's embarrassing. The Magnavox Odyssey was the first video game console ever made, and that's all it will really ever be to me. The console was capable of displaying 2 player-controlled dots, as well as a dot the console itself would control. Oh, and there would be a vertical line, because you simply cannot have fun without a vertical line. Try it, see how far it gets you. All of that added up to an experience that the person who owns this tombstone probably enjoyed. But even though we can laugh at it today, the console was revolutionary for the time. If you wanted to have fun at home before this, you better hope your library has the Grapes of Wrath. The console made use of screen overlays that would enhance the simple graphics of the games provided on the 11 game cards that were made for the system. Many of the game cards could use multiple overlays, which gave the illusion of having fun in a variety of ways. And the Odyssey was the only non-dedicated console released during the first generation, as every main console after this resorted to having whatever games it wanted already stored on the console itself. But even though the Odyssey had a large impact on the consoles that followed it, along with the video game industry as a whole, it was only kinda successful. Through a combination of the Odyssey's price, being sold through only Magnavox dealers, and consumers just not understanding what on earth this was, the Odyssey met low initial sales upon its first year in the market in 1972, only selling around 70,000 units. This made the Odyssey look likely to be discontinued, but because of the positive reception that the Odyssey received by those who did purchase it, they chose to press forward with its production. In late 1973, along with being released in other countries, the Odyssey's price was lowered significantly if it was purchased along with the TV. Along with that, the marketing for the Odyssey was starting to become much more prevalent. As a result, 89,000 units were sold in 1973, 129,000 units were sold in 1974, and 80,000 units were sold in 1975. The Odyssey managed to sell more than 350,000 units throughout its life, with the system being discontinued in late 1975. But even though this was a great improvement compared to where the console was headed in 1972, it wasn't really much of a success overall. However, one of the worst mistakes that the Odyssey made was giving their competition a loaded gun in the form of 2 paddles and a ball, because while the Odyssey was fumbling out the door, Atari was taking notes. Gathering inspiration from the table tennis game found on one of the game cards for the Odyssey, Atari made Pong, and it blew up. It's easily one of the most influential early arcade releases and is among the most famous games of all time. If you've ever met someone who doesn't know what Pong is, you're either lying or communicating with an infant child. This prompted Atari to put out a dedicated Pong system so people could enjoy plagiarism at home. Magnavox took notice of this and tried to get Atari to admit that Pong was inspired by the Magnavox Odyssey, which prompted some guy named Bushnell to give the statement, "The fact is, I absolutely did see the Odyssey game, and I didn't think it was very clever," which was basically a middle finger to Magnavox if it decided to take the form of a quote. But Atari was forced to settle a lawsuit that was thrown at them, as the legal costs for winning the case would have exceeded their funds. But despite this, the home Pong console managed to sell a modest 200,000 units during its lifetime. And on the note of other lawsuits that were filed by Magnavox across the next 20 years before the Odyssey-related patents expired in the 90s, mostly against other Pong-like entities, they were able to earn a total of $100 million. On a completely unrelated and unimportant note, the Electro Tennis was the first home console in Japan, releasing a few months before the release of Home Pong, but it only sold 10,000 units, and I have yet to meet a single die-hard fan of the Electro Tennis, no matter what the guy in the corner of my living room has to say about that. But even though Magnavox and Atari were only 2 of the 3 main competitors that were going for the highest number of units sold during this generation, they were definitely the most vicious towards each other, which makes the fact that Coleco did better than both of them combined even funnier. Introducing the Coleco Telstar. This is just another Pong clone. Even though this was just another Pong console, the first model alone sold more than 1 million units, and there were 14 models. But it should be known that the later models didn't do nearly as well as the first, and this large lineup of useless Pong consoles did nothing but blend into the crowd of other garbage low-quality Pong consoles, nearly bringing Coleco to bankruptcy in 1980. With all of that in mind, it's surprising that the Coleco Telstar did as well as it did. There isn't anywhere near as much information on this console compared to the Odyssey or Home Pong, but from what I can gather, it did well mostly due to its cheap price. So after all of that, who came on top during the first generation? If it wasn't Magnavox, and it wasn't Atari, then it has to be Nintendo.
This was rigged from the beginning.
The Color TV game was Nintendo's own variation of the Pong consoles, but unlike Atari, Nintendo actually got permission from Magnavox to put its own spin on their table tennis game. But Nintendo reigned supreme because the Color TV game was released in Japan as opposed to the other consoles, which means that this was the level of competition that Nintendo faced. They not only dominated the Japanese video game market with their quality, but with their cheap pricing as well. Like with Coleco, a large part of their success was due to having an accessible price point, because they don't think that many people thought this experience was worth $700. There were 4 models of the Color TV game, with the Color TV game 6 being the first of its kind, and when I say that, I really mean it's just Pong again. But the fun gimmick of this version was that there were 6 different ways of playing it, which tweaks certain aspects of the game's design. Similarly, the Color TV game 15 provided 9 extra ways of playing the game, so if you have a calculator, things will start to add up. Both of these sold around 1 million each, so that already puts it past Coleco. But just to drive home their point even further, Color TV game Racing 112, a game where you could drive from left to right in order to avoid obstacles, as well as Color TV game Block Kazushi, a breakout clone, both sold 500,000 each, making the total unit sales of the Color TV game series more than 3 million. And with that, the winner of the first console war is pretty clear. But I will say that Nintendo was mostly off in their own corner while all the action was going on in the States. For all of you Electro Tennis fans out there, please disregard that statement. But there was much more going on during this generation than I ever would have expected. Just because there weren't that many people invested in video games at the time, it did quite a lot to set up the much larger unit sales of the feature consoles that we would see. Speaking of which...
Spoilers?
This happened 30 years ago. The Atari 2600 managed to sell 30 million units, which is quite literally 10 times better than its strongest competition. But why did it do as well as it did? Why did people willingly choose to subject themselves to this? Here's a better question. Would you trust a corpse? If so, well, do I have a collection of consoles for you. Every console during this generation that wasn't the Atari 2600 either made some really stupid decisions that led to its underperformance, or just didn't do anything in general. Case in point, the Fairchild Channel F, which sadly left out both the case and the point. This was the first console of the second generation. Was it worth it? The main reason this console sold so poorly was because of the games that it offered. They were all just slowly paced educational games. So you better get used to garbage like Math Quiz 2, Backgammon, and Blackjack, or you could just wait a year to make sure you still have a pulse. As for the second generation consoles that released after the Atari 2600, the Magnavox Odyssey 2, because it went so well the first time. On the second time around, Magnavox fared much better, but that's mostly a side effect of the video game industry growing to new heights in the late 70s and early 80s. But it also did better because the games were of a decent quality. Now that doesn't mean any of them really hold up to today's standards, but neither does any game from this generation. So give me an E, give me an H, and we finally have my opinion of this console. Because outside of the games, this console was inferior to the competition in many ways, particularly with its graphics, which feature noticeably less colors and noticeably more bad, which is pretty hypocritical seeing as I don't really derive any more fun from looking at this compared to this. But even so, by its discontinuation, it had only sold 2 million units, which was a good improvement over the sales of the previous generation, but it still doesn't even come close to the success of the Atari 2600. Then there's the Intellivision, deriving from the words intelligent and television. This is neither of those things. But it is the second best-selling console of its generation, so it must have done something right. It wasn't that the Intellivision did anything overtly good to warrant its success, it's just that it didn't do anything necessarily awful. It had decent graphics, maybe even a bit better than what Atari was offering. The game library wasn't filled with a bunch of junk, and add-ons like the IntelliVoice, which would speak to you using a speech synthesizer for compatible cartridges, didn't do as bad as you might think. Advertisements positioned the Intellivision as the more powerful console compared to the Atari 2600. Whenever the Magnavox Odyssey 2 tried to do something like that, it would become the punchline and a really good joke book. But this actually posed a bit of a comparison between the two, and it still didn't matter. The Intellivision got up to 3 million units before biting the dust, and while it put up a fair fight, it was no match for the Atari. So by the time the ColecoVision entered the picture, it was already too late. This was a good 5 years after the release of the Atari 2600 in 1977, which meant that Atari already had a practically undisputed reign over video game sales, and not much was going to change that. So it's surprising that the ColecoVision did as well as it did, selling 2 million copies by the end of its short 3-year lifespan. It mostly did well because of its superb graphics, which were great at replicating the quality of arcade games, more so than any other second generation console. And it also helps that Donkey Kong was bundled with the system, as it was mostly a showcase to show how much better this console was compared to the Atari 2600. But because of upcoming circumstances, this console never got the chance to do much except watch an execution. The Atari 5200, I'll have to put this one in the joke book. This console was initially made to compete with the Intellivision, but ended up squaring off against the ColecoVision instead, with both systems releasing in 1982. The Atari 5200 only sold around 1.5 million units, and it is abundantly clear why. The main gimmick of the 5200 was that it had better graphics than the 2600. So does Dirt. But with the ColecoVision being its main competitor, that console still had slightly better graphics than the 5200. And the only games on the 5200 were updated 2600 games, so why wouldn't you just buy 2600 instead? The 2600 already had a vast library of games, and because the 5200 wasn't backwards compatible and barely had any games, you'd be stupid not to buy a 2600 instead. On top of that, the pack-in title, the game that was supposed to showcase the superior power of the 5200, was Super Breakout. If you ever feel like you're worthless, just remember that you have much more to add to this world than Super Breakout added to the 5200.
Tell that to the orphanage that just burnt down.
This didn't help matters when it came to the 5200 sales, as it mostly highlighted the problems that many had with this system. Not many 2600 games warranted versions of a higher quality, because are you really going to be playing on Atari for the graphics? This console served little to no purpose in the grand scheme of the second generation consoles, and will only ever be remembered as... Ew. I stepped in something. The 2600 was the first console brave enough to outsell the Wii U, so for that, it has my respect. But why did it do this well?
It smells nice.
The system released in 1977, and the funny thing is, it didn't do all too well. During this year, it only sold around 400,000 units, and that's mostly the fault of the delay that the legal battle between Magnavox and Atari caused, along with the concept of swappable cartridges. This was the first console to standardize the use of cartridges in home video game consoles, which would stay true until Sega and Sony spit in my food. Unless you count the Fairchild Channel F, which did use swappable cartridges. But guess what? It also didn't sell 30 million units, so I think I'm in the right when I say that this had a bit more influence on the industry. Though the cartridge trend didn't catch on as well as Atari would have liked it to, because they didn't fare all too well in 1978, selling around the same amount as in 1977. They did do a bit better in 1979, getting around 1 million units in sales, which was when most people started to understand what a game was, but because there was a heaping dose of competition over the horizon in the form of the Magnavox Odyssey 2 and the Intellivision, it was looking more and more likely that Atari might not win this one. So what happened here? That's all it takes? The conversions of the arcade titles Space Invaders and Pac-Man is what got this system to the heights it reached by the time of its discontinuation in 1992. The system was in its prime during the very early 80s, getting to 15 million of these things sold by the end of 1982. After that, it continued to sell quite modestly up until 1992, and that leads to another one of the reasons it triumphed over its competition. It didn't immediately cease to exist after 1983. 1983 is a very notorious year in gaming history, as it's when the video game market crashed due to a number of reasons, and the only second generation console to truly survive it was the Atari 2600. Both the Magnavox Odyssey 2 and the Intellivision ceased to be relevant once the crash hit, and Coleco moved on to... Yikes. But the Atari 2600 managed to keep on selling after the crash, which leads right into the third generation. Jesus! What the hell is that? This generation of consoles is where Nintendo truly came into the console market. Sure, they had made the Color TV game series, as well as the Game & Watch series of handheld devices, which were successes in their own right, but the NES truly catapulted Nintendo into the spot they're in today. Nintendo is, and will always be, my favorite figure in the console market. I believe that no one else has come close to the quality and love that their games receive, and that many of their games have and will go down as some of the most influential pieces of media in history. And in more important news, I will direct you to the tattoo on my left arm. I should really get that removed. The NES might just be the most important console release in history, because if it failed, we might not even be seeing video games as they are in the modern age. The first two generations of consoles are really in their own little bubble, as most of the progress that those consoles put into the industry evaporated when 1983 decided to be 1983 and 1983 all over the unit sales of everyone unfortunate enough to be in the room. And even though Atari did have a relevant console during this generation, we should really put some heavy sarcasm on relevant. Because funnily enough, the NES set the video game market on the current path it's on in terms of a standard for units sold, the licensing of third parties, the popularity of gaming in the United States, and it would lay the groundwork for the three giants in gaming today. So basically, if you don't have this, you also don't have this. And it's all because of that pesky year. Nintendo saw that gaming in the United States was taking a nosedive off of a cliff into a slab of concrete with just nails on it, which couldn't have been fun. And so Nintendo decided to release the Famicom in just the Japanese market during 1983. It wasn't off to a roaring success because of some of the internal issues with the console itself at launch, but once those issues were fixed, people realized that the Famicom had Donkey Kong. I'd like to keep my wallet, thank you very much. And Donkey Kong Jr. Where do I sign? The Famicom did quite well in the Japanese market during 1984, becoming the highest selling video game console in Japan at the time. But Nintendo was still watching a corpse and thinking to themselves, If only. But even though Nintendo was looking even more likely to try and raise the dead by bringing the Famicom outside of Japan, it was clear that any attempt to do so in 1984 would have led to nothing but FURNITURE.
That doesn't spell failure.
So instead of jumping headfirst into a pile of nails, Nintendo introduced many Famicom games to the US through the arcades, which were still alive and well. They accomplished this through the Versus System arcade cabinets, which provided single-player and multiplayer offerings to any Dr. Mario enthusiasts out there. These did extraordinarily well, selling nearly 100,000 cabinets to arcades all across America. But even then, releasing a video game console was still quite a risky move, as many lost trust in the placement of video games in the home after the market became oversaturated in 1983. So Nintendo wanted to try as hard as possible to avoid the stigma of the NES being labeled as a video game console. But what else would you call it? A really bad dinner plate. Before all of this video game nonsense, Nintendo was known as a toy manufacturer, making some very creative uses of plastic. And they applied much of that creativity towards their gaming products. If you look at an Atari 2600 with all of its switches, its refined logo, the wood grain finish, it makes me feel like I should wash my hands before laying a finger on the thing. But if you look at an NES, my video game console detector from 1985 isn't going off. Nintendo wanted the NES to be viewed as anything but a video game system. Instead, they dubbed it an entertainment system, along with calling video games game packs. They also included Rob the Robot along with the NES early on in its life in order to get people to view the NES as more of a toy. Even peripherals like the light gun, which can be seen as quite simple nowadays, were quite novel at the time, and garnered the NES far more attention than it would have gained if it walked into the North American video game market in 1984 and proclaimed that it was the most revolutionary video game console of all time and that it would bring joy to tens of millions of homes across America and become one of the most iconic pieces of hardware in gaming history. Doing that is basically like proclaiming you're the son of God. So I wouldn't have been surprised if the NES was crucified shortly after. But luckily, Nintendo took a very patient and cautious approach to the release of the NES, and it certainly paid off for them. Unlike many of the consoles before 1983, Nintendo didn't try to exaggerate the capabilities of the graphical power of the NES, most of the time. Atari would always have the coolest looking things in their box art, and when you play the game itself, well, someone lied. While some NES games could have been slightly misleading, they often used the black box template to showcase what the graphics of the system were. You don't have to imagine that this is somehow related to whatever this is. All you have to do is look at the box and wow, these are the same things. Companies don't have to do this as much today because graphics have improved. We've started to get stuff that looks much closer to what the old Atari boxes promised. All of these features were far different from what video game consoles were at the time, which is ironic because most of what the NES had to defer itself from being labeled as a video game console have become standards for pretty much every video game console today. Even if you despise Nintendo and their empire of sin and lack of remorse, you have to admit that this right here was pretty important. And for all of these reasons, it's no wonder that the NES sold more than 60 million units. Neither of Nintendo's competitors during this generation could even come close to being in the same league as Nintendo. The NES had the games that everyone wanted, and it basically made for a situation where if you didn't want to look like a loser from the years 1985 to 1988, it was required that you have one of these in your household. Because in the year 2023, I'm being called a loser for having one. The NES was a perfect system for the time, and if as many people were interested in video games back then as there are now, I'm sure that this would have been one of, if not the best-selling console of all time. Because the NES didn't just get the console market back on its feet again, it brought it back stronger than it had ever been before, which was all the result of Nintendo's patience, innovation, and an incredible library of games. As for the Sega Master System, let's just say it wasn't as important as the NES. The Master System tried its hardest to be a rival to Nintendo, but it ended up as the punching bag to a string of jokes that started with Tonka? It was pretty clear that Sega had absolutely no idea why the NES did so well, because they made so many stupid business decisions during this era that I would be here talking about Sega's failures longer than I did for Nintendo's successes. And along with that, the Master System had a pathetic game library. If someone ever says they wanted to play a game for the Master System, you should try and dispose of them as soon as possible. That person should no longer be treated like they have any self-respect.
Man, I could really go for a Golden Axe Warrior right about now.
The Master System sold around 13 million units during this generation, and it only got to that point because some saps in Europe actually liked the thing. But I don't know, personally, I think they might have just felt bad for it. And with this generation, it was pretty clear that Atari wouldn't make it much farther. The Atari 7800 had almost nothing going for it at all. The only thing that got it up to selling 3 million units was the Atari name alone. The budget for marketing the system was vastly lower than the competition, and it had far less games than both the Master System and the NES. And when it was clear that the 7800 wasn't working out, its successor was unceremoniously released very shortly after. Nintendo won this generation by a landslide, and they would go on to always release the best-selling systems until the end of time. If only. The battle between Sega and Nintendo during this generation just might be the most iconic console war of all time. Neither the Genesis or the SNES set records in terms of unit sales, as the NES sold much more than both of them. But the lengths that each company was willing to go to in order to sell a couple extra units is absolutely despicable. So, yeah. The Sega Genesis. I have one of these on my dartboard. The NES was truly the only console you needed during the mid-80s. I think most people refuse to admit that other consoles even existed. And now we're gonna play a game of spot the company that can't take no for an answer. One of the main reasons the Master System failed here in North America was because Sega sold its US distribution rights to Tonka, who had no prior experience with consoles. And it went about as well as you'd expect it to. It was also released after Nintendo got their head into the 8-bit console market, so even if they did market the Master System well in America, Nintendo still held such a dominant power. So taking these mistakes into consideration, the time at which Sega released the Genesis and how they consistently marketed it throughout its entire life felt very strategic. The Sega Genesis released 2 whole years before the SNES, which is most likely because they wanted to escape the sinking ship that was the Master System, while also being one of the first to delve into the 16-bit console market. So in 1988, Sega released the Genesis, or the Mega Drive in Japan, and while it was looking like it might actually do well, sound the alarms. Super Mario Bros. 3 was such a monumental title because not only did it cause my grandparents to go into cardiac arrest, but it overshadowed the release of the Mega Drive to the point where it was never able to recover its image in Japan. So when Sega brought the Genesis to America the following year, they took quite a radical approach. Just quickly giving my opinion on this console though, this reeks. I've never liked the Genesis, and I've always found it to be one of, if not the most overrated console of all time. Wow, would you look at my left arm? I don't find many of its games to be all that interesting, and even the ones that are touted as the best of what the system has to offer are just kind of okay. At the point when this released, the NES had a far more vast and diverse lineup of games that everyone could find some enjoyment in, and the upcoming SNES, we'll get there when we get there. I thought that maybe the only way I would be able to truly enjoy a Genesis was to actually own one, but all that really accomplished was sinning. This system and I will probably never get along, and all of this only makes it so that I despise how close it was to overtaking Nintendo. The thing is, I don't really mind as much that Nintendo was eventually beaten on later occasions, because you actually had a reason to own these consoles compared to these ones. Those made legitimately smarter uses of their hardware and game library. And because the Genesis was worse than the SNES in almost every way possible, a core feature of many Genesis advertisements was deception. The slogan, "Genesis does what Nintendo don't," refers to how the Genesis has more arcade-style games, but that isn't necessarily made clear by the advertisement, making it seem like Nintendo and the people that played Nintendo games were squares, which is embarrassing because I thought I was a trapezoid. The slogan is really the only thing to take away from this ad, because none of the games on show here were gonna light the world on fire. When the ad was first released though, the SNES didn't really exist yet, so yeah, you can't do this on Nintendo, unless you're patient. But even though the commercial gave Genesis fans something to throw back at their Nintendo-loving counterparts, it still didn't bring the Genesis up to be any more of a success. Sure, it was admirable that Sega was making an attempt to spit on my copy of Super Mario Bros. 3, but their game library at the time was not a great looker. Hell, I still don't think it is. Many games decided to go the route of gaining popularity by slapping the name of celebrities and athletes on the front cover. This ain't your everyday basketball, this is Pat Riley basketball. But oh, would you look at that? That didn't work either. So what did work? Is it too late to go back? Sonic the Hedgehog was the exact thing that Sega needed. It was, and still is, the icon of Sega. They have made other games and plenty of other franchises, but none will ever be as important as Sonic. Sega had been trying to find the perfect mascot for quite some time in order to rival Nintendo's Mario, and Sonic was both eye-catching and representative of the attitude of the Sega Genesis, cool and cocky. As for the quality of the game itself, it proved to be revolutionary with the scope of its levels, the graphics, and its speed. That was all it took to get consumers hooked on the Genesis. The previous pack and title, Altered Beast, was thrown out the window in favor of the obvious choice, and it wasn't even that good of a game. I mean, it isn't an awful game, and I'd rather play it compared to 97% of the Genesis's library, but this game peaks in the first level and barely has anything remarkable beyond that. The only Sonic games on the Genesis that I would play for pleasure are 3 and Knuckles, but I feel like that might just be a me thing because people in the 90s could not care less. Along with the release of Sonic the Hedgehog, Sega began to position the Genesis as the cooler console for more mature gamers, so many teens wouldn't dare associate themselves with having a good time. And this stigma around Nintendo consoles being for dumb, stupid kids hurt Nintendo in the long run. And my feelings. I think it's about time we talk about the SNES, because unlike that stinky thing over there, I'd gladly talk about this piece of garbage for an hour. The SNES, or the Super Famicom, was able to very easily gain support in Japan. It kept Nintendo as the undoubted leader of Japan's console market for quite some time. Nintendo hit it off big with the third parties during this generation, and had not only some of the greatest first-party games of all time, but also some of the greatest third-party games of all time. But when the SNES arrived in North America, that didn't matter. Sega already held much of the 16-bit console market because of their 2-year head start, along with the most pompous ads I've ever seen. This isn't a paper towel commercial. Both Sega and Nintendo tried to make it seem like their consoles might have been doing better than they actually were, which is why it's hard to gauge who exactly was winning the war here. Sega used the term blast processing to make it seem like the Genesis was the most capable thing man has ever done when sitting next to an SNES, when in reality, it didn't really mean much and was just a bunch of marketing fluff. That's like if I said, "Ooh, I have a longer belt than you. Look at how stupid you are right now. I bet you don't even have a belt."
Well, at least I can rest easy knowing I have bigger toes than you.
Given how petty everything was getting to be at this point, it's a miracle that Donkey Kong got there when it did. Donkey Kong Country was a revival of the old Donkey Kong series on arcades developed by Rare, who would go on to be one of Nintendo's most important allies during the next generation. But for now, this was more than enough. This was a graphical spectacle for the SNES, which helped defeat the claims that the Sega Genesis looked better than the SNES. But what about a Sega Genesis with a growth? Nintendo has finally met their match. In hell. The Sega CD was an add-on for the Sega Genesis. Ooh, I wonder how this is gonna push the boundaries of what video games are capable of. Never mind. This thing was expensive, had a very boring game library, featured some pretty weak video quality, not to mention it was extremely late to the party considering it wasn't released in North America until 1992. I know Donkey Kong Country released in 1994, but that was just a game used to jazz up the roster of Nintendo games near the end of the SNES's Song and Dance, which ended up garnering a huge amount of support because good people like good games. Now, I can confidently say that the Sega CD rid the world of 2.24 million good people. I know complaining about the Genesis's library was a bit controversial, but I don't think I'm overstepping here when I say that the Sega CD's library was nothing but sad and pathetic. I lied, it was also asinine. The only game on this thing that anyone might be willing to bring up in good faith is Sonic CD, but I hate to break it to you, this game isn't very good, and that alone makes it the best game on the Sega CD. Even some reviewers at the time were mixed about the CD, because if you wanted a bigger library of games along with better graphics in the early 90s, have I found the perfect system for you. These add-ons just made the Sega Genesis look insecure when matching itself up with Nintendo, which is why the marketing of the Genesis had to find the tiniest positives about the Genesis and make them seem like a way bigger deal than they actually were. Because at the end of the day, even though Sega didn't want to admit it, the SNES had far better hardware quality. And the only way for Sega to not look like they couldn't get it together was to stress out and make another pointless add-on, the 32X. I think that's a good point to leave it off at. I wouldn't say that the Genesis is an awful console. It had some good third-party support, and I do find enjoyment in some of the system's bigger titles. Emphasis on some. But let's be honest here, even when pushing aside my bias, the SNES had better games, more games, a large variety of games, no useless add-ons that just made things more expensive, and this is one of the greatest consoles of all time.
Yeah, but it's nowhere near as good as Electro Tennis.
The SNES won this generation, not only worldwide with 49 million units, but it also did better than the Genesis in North America, beating it out by around 1 million units. The Sega Genesis sold around 30 million units worldwide, which was quite good considering how much dominance Nintendo held in the third generation. But Nintendo deserved their win this generation, and that isn't just the bias talking, it's also the voices in my head. This generation saw the introduction of Nintendo's worst mistakes in their long history as a company, with one of them being their decision to piss off Sony. At one point, Nintendo and Sony were working together to create a CD add-on for the SNES, because that went so well for Sega. This thing got quite far into development, but after Nintendo actually looked at their contract with Sony, they noticed that it gave Sony so much leverage over Nintendo that it wasn't even funny. So Nintendo cut ties with Sony, and in a situation without any hindsight, that was probably a smart move. Come a few years later, I feel like a bit of hindsight would have been nice. Nintendo instead decided to partner with Philips, which led to the creation of some games for the Philips CDI that are what I can only describe as what they'll probably force me to do in hell. So Sony decided that they didn't need Nintendo, though they had gained plenty of knowledge about making consoles during their partnership with Nintendo. And with that knowledge, they set out to make the PlayStation, and Sega set out to fail. While the Sega Genesis and SNES were still quite relevant in 1994, as both kept getting game releases for quite a few more years, the more powerful Sega Saturn and PlayStation were released in the same year. And after Sega dunked on Nintendo during the fourth generation, they were feeling practically invincible. Both consoles did well in Japan at first, with the Saturn managing to sell more than the PlayStation in 1994, but a large problem the Saturn had during this generation was with its game library, which mostly consisted of arcade ports. The PlayStation was able to outsell it quite quickly because of how much third-party support they were able to gain. Sega knew that they needed to get the Sega Saturn to North America as quickly as possible, which led to another problem that was going to plague Sega throughout this generation. Sega. The Sega Saturn released in North America as a surprise announcement, releasing on practically the same day it was announced. As a result, many retailers didn't have much time to prepare for the Saturn's existence and refused to carry it for some time. To be fair, if one of these jumped me in a dark alley, I'd react accordingly. On top of that, the Sega Saturn found itself at a cost of $400 US and a country that didn't think Virtua Fighter was worth getting into more national debt for, which made Sony's response sting even more. Sony was looking to be the new Sega of this generation, showing up the competition with its spunk and sheer willpower. The PlayStation released in the US in the September of 1995, and without any of the problems that the Saturn had, it sold exponentially well. The Sega Saturn never fully recovered from its fatal blow of a launch, and though its library was decent, Sony was far more appealing with its third-party support and cheap cost. But I'm sick of talking about consoles that I wish I didn't own, and by those rules, I shouldn't be talking about this thing either. So while Sony and Sega were duking it out, what was Nintendo doing? The Nintendo 64 didn't release until 1996, a full 2 years after the release of the Saturn and the PlayStation. Nintendo first announced that they were working on something respectable in 1993 with Project Reality, which showed off some very capable graphics that made the upcoming Saturn and PlayStation afraid of the reckoning. The SNES was able to hold out Nintendo until the console released, keeping Nintendo as a main competitor in the console market despite not having a 5th generation console yet. The project was soon revealed to be named the Nintendo Ultra 64, because one subtitle wasn't enough for Nintendo in 1994. Now Nintendo in 1995, they had enough self-esteem to ditch the Ultra, and they also, maybe they had a bit too much self-esteem. The Virtual Boy was made for the purpose of holding Nintendo over until the walls came crashing down in 1996. But the only thing consumers got out of it was Virtual Boy Wario Land and a new punching bag. But when the 64 released, it carried with it one of the most revolutionary games of all time. And it pains me to say, that it was not piloting 64. Super Mario 64 is one of the most important games in video game history, revolutionizing what it meant to be a game. There were 3D ventures before this on the Saturn and PlayStation, but none of them matched the scope of what Super Mario 64 was able to do in its sleep. That's impressive. The Nintendo 64 sold incredibly well at launch, with Super Mario 64 being the game to own. Mario Kart 64 released a few months later, and it was looking like this was going to be a slam dunk of a system. But you want to know what happened? Yeah. Nothing. Because the concept of 3D games was quite a new thing to Nintendo, they had trouble consistently pumping out masterpieces as well as they did with previous generations. And where third parties would usually pick up the slack, where did everyone go? Well, another one of Nintendo's biggest mistakes wasn't this. It was this. By some point in the early 90s, people realized that CDs were the future of gaming, as they could hold far more space than standard ROM cartridges and were easier to develop for. Both the PlayStation and the Saturn used CDs to run their games, and as a result, while their systems were still technically inferior to the Nintendo 64 in many ways, the games themselves were able to pack a far bigger punch on most occasions, being primed for longer experiences such as RPGs. In comparison, Nintendo used They were just asking for it at this point. The 64 barely had any third-party support when compared to Sony. The only third party that was making bank off of the 64 was Rare, who developed all of these games, which ranged from not bad to masterpieces. While the PlayStation had games everyone could enjoy, the 64 was a system made for Nintendo fans. Because even if Nintendo had a bit of trouble putting out games, they definitely went for quality over quantity. There was Super Smash Bros., Mario Parties 1 through 3, Kirby 64, Donkey Kong 64, F-Zero X, the Mario sports titles, Paper Mario, Ocarina of Time. Every time Nintendo would actually release a game for the 64, it was very rare that it would disappoint. But still, all of these games were very much geared toward a specific audience of people who were just as delusional as I am. Nintendo fans were willing to look past all of the issues because the games were just that good. And it was also the best party system, not only because many of its titles were practically built for multiplayer, but this was the only prominent console during this generation to include 4-player multiplayer, which made games like Mario Kart 64 feel like fully realized beings. Super Smash Bros. And Mario Party gave people experiences that simply couldn't be done on PlayStation. But while Nintendo was doing that, the PlayStation was continuing to have every third-party game under the sun, with much larger games and an incredibly large library. But in Nintendo's defense, they did have the Rumble Pack.
And that would be my cue to leave.
But if you'll notice, the pettiness that was present during the last generation was nowhere near as existent here. Sure, there would be an ad here and there where they would make fun of each other, but aside from Sega, who was still trying to put up a fight despite, there wasn't nearly as much boasting or belittling. It was pretty obvious where this generation was going from the moment that the 64 released. The 64 was restricted by its cartridge format while also being 2 years late to the party. The Saturn had the worst possible launch and a library that appealed to almost nobody. And the PlayStation had every third-party game at their disposal, games that everyone could get behind, and almost no hardware limitations. But there was one thing that could have saved the 64. And no, it wasn't the Rumble Pack, the 64DD. How was I supposed to finish that sentence? The 64DD was set to be an add-on for the 64 that would be able to house games with far larger storage capacities, and what it ended up being was an empty promise. The add-on took a while to exist, and when it did release, it didn't. It was only ever released in Japan, and it was rarely ever in stores, choosing to be sold for the mail as a starter kit. Many games were planned for the DD, and it would have made the system so much cooler if it managed to be a success. I don't think it would have saved the 64 from its battle against the PlayStation, even if it was about as successful as something like the Sega CD, but it would have at the very least made it so that they were able to have a few more third-party games given all the improvements that the 64DD proposed. But as it stood, the PlayStation was able to topple Nintendo's monopoly over the video game market, selling more than 100 million units, compared to Nintendo's 32 million, showing that no matter how infallible a company may seem at one point, it's always possible that they could fall apart the next day. Speaking of which, how well did the Sega Saturn do? I mean, it couldn't have been that bad. Oh my god. Sega was truly never able to recover from the Saturn's launch, as they kept mismanaging everything that the Saturn was and did. It didn't have the accessibility of PlayStation, nor the first-party powerhouses like Nintendo. It was simply the Sega Saturn. The Genesis was successful because it had spunk and Sonic. The Saturn had neither of those. No mainline Sonic titles released for the system, which is a shame because that would have at the very least sold a few million more people on the Saturn. It would be like if Nintendo decided that the 64 didn't need a Mario game. We have Glover. We should be fine. And that's honestly underselling it, because Nintendo has so many popular first-party franchises that it shouldn't even be allowed to joke about it. But as for Sega's one and only Golden Goose, he was relegated to nothing but spin-offs and a compilation. Sonic Extreme seemed to be in the works for some time, but just from looking at the footage, it's pretty clear that this game was going nowhere. And because of the failure of the Saturn, Sega was going to have to get their act together quickly, or they might cease to be a console manufacturer. So it was very critical that their next move was an overwhelming success. Damn it, Sega.
What happened to the other guy?
Doubt in the Lord.
Well, in that case, I've come to spread the good news of Madden 21.
Oh thanks, I already got arms.
You.
Nobody gets me. The Sega Saturn was rapidly turning from a sinking ship into a sinking ship on fire, barreling towards the bottom of the ocean at record-breaking speeds. And the only reasonable thing would have been to break into the 6th generation as soon as possible. In 1998, the Dreamcast was revealed and launched in Japan as the next step in their console business. So by now, Sega must have realized that their problem was that their game library didn't have a massive appeal to everyone, especially in the United States. So you'd think that they would try and launch with something that isn't Virtua Fighter 3. But what do I know? They also put out Godzilla Generations. How did this console not do well? I will say that this launch wasn't as disastrous as it could have been, and certainly not as idiotic as how Sega handled the launch of the Saturn, but it was bogged down by a high failure rate in the manufacturing process, along with not enough actual games. Virtua Fighter 3 was the only successful one of the bunch, and I still feel like making fun of it because I don't know, it's Virtua Fighter 3. But let it be known that a legitimate Sonic game was on the horizon, and unlike Mr. Non-Existent over there, this game actually showed some promise. But even when Sonic Adventure finally released, it didn't help matters all too much. It is a good game and translated Sonic into 3D quite well, but it wasn't enough to stop Japanese consumers from thinking that the Dreamcast was the lamest thing known to man at the time. Seaman did well though. Some people were even returning their Dreamcasts out of disappointment, so they could just go and buy more PlayStation games. Soon after though, Sega of America decided to try and repair its relationship with retailers before the Dreamcast made its way to the US market. And because of games like Sonic Adventure and a heap of impressive graphics, the Dreamcast had a very successful launch in America. And if the story was supposed to have a happy ending, it should have ended right there. But even still, after the launch of the Dreamcast came the decline of the Dreamcast. The PS2 had already been announced, and it was looking to be far more advanced than the Dreamcast, along with having all of the games that were actually popular. Nintendo was also a bit of a wrench in Sega's plans, as their upcoming GameCube was seeming to carry with it much more popularity than the Dreamcast. Again, with all of these games that were actually popular. And on top of that, Microsoft was looking to enter the console market, and we all know how that turned out. With that, Sega became desperate, leading to price cuts and deals that basically made the Dreamcast unprofitable. Where Sega was once at the top, facing off against the giant that was Nintendo, now it was struggling to have any presence in the medium of video games. The games for the Dreamcast are considered to be quite good, but nothing they did was groundbreaking, which is what they would have needed in order to overthrow the reign of the PlayStation. And so, at the end of March in 2001, Sega discontinued the Dreamcast, ending their time as a console manufacturer while bringing them into being a third-party developer. But even though it is unfortunate, Sega has been doing far better as a third-party developer compared to how they were doing when the Dreamcast was tumbling off a cliff that happened to be on fire. Sega becoming a third-party developer was probably the best thing for them, as many people feel like their games were their best attribute as a console manufacturer. That isn't to say that every game of theirs since then have been masterpieces, or even good, but people have a special place in their heart for Sega and its franchises, especially Sonic. The Dreamcast might have been a failure, but it certainly set them on the path to a brighter future. and Balan Wonderworld. The PS2 is one of the best-selling consoles of all time, and it dwarfed basically every other console during this generation. We know that the Dreamcast was dead on arrival, but how did it get such an advantage over both Microsoft and Nintendo? Microsoft's Xbox was the most powerful of the bunch, and Nintendo's GameCube was one of the best things ever invented by man. If it were between the GameCube and tap water, you know which one I'd pick. Well, looking at the previous generation, the PlayStation was a very strong brand, and once people heard that there was going to be a second one, it was like they announced the second coming of Christ. As successful as the launch of the Dreamcast was in North America, most people decided to hold out until the PS2 because it was such a big thing. Another reason why the PS2 saw itself sell well was because it could also act as a standard DVD player at a time when DVD players were a bit hard to come by. For that reason, the PS2 was a very warranted buy for most. It could play the most popular games on the planet, and it could also play Kung Fu Panda. The PS2 was also one of the first consoles to have notable backwards compatibility. The Atari 7800 had it, but it was also the Atari 7800. That meant that the full library of PS1 games could also be played on the PS2. With that, they not only roped in the people who might be interested in the fancy looking PS2 games, but also those who wanted to have more of an excuse to play PS1 games. Speaking of PS2 games, how many PS2 games are there exactly? I said exactly. The PS2 has one of the largest game libraries out there, meaning that this console had games that appealed to pretty much everyone. You might not like 99% of the PS2's output, but that still leaves you with around 40 or so games. The PS2 is truly a crowd pleaser, and is certainly deserving of its place as one of the best-selling consoles of all time. The PS2 sold consistently well throughout its life, without ever dropping the ball. And with how many perks the console came with, it's no wonder that the PS2 did as well as it did. Okay. Back to the tragedies. Nintendo was now struggling in comparison to Sony, mostly because of the 64 doing the most 64 thing it could have done. Be the 64. So with their next console being poised as the successor to the 64, tragedy strikes. The console was announced in 1999 with the codename Dolphin, which was just around 3 years after the release of the 64. And that's because the 64 was looking more and more like a dead end. Sega already had their next console out for the world to see, Sony was already showing off the PS2, and Microsoft was looking likely to become another competitor in the console market. To make up for that, Nintendo teased DVD compatibility, just like how I'm teasing my ankle. The console, now known as the GameCube, was fully announced at Space World 2000, in which many games were shown, and even more hearts were broken. First of all, what is this? Nintendo chose to use mini DVDs as opposed to standard DVDs because God forbid we be normal. I mean, you were already signing that away when you bought this thing, but these simply can't hold as much data as a standard DVD game. Comparing the two, the only positives I can come up with for the GameCube's discs is that they're, I don't know, edible. And not only is it bad news for the games, but it also meant that there was no DVD compatibility. Ha! But while the GameCube might not be looking too great to the average schmuck, I'm a sucker for geometry.
I prefer calculus.
Starting off with some smaller positives, the GameCube, and that was enough to get me going. The GameCube released in 2001 with a pretty standard lineup of games. You had Luigi's Mansion, Wave Race, and Super Monkey Ball. If any other games released during the GameCube's launch, please don't tell me. Luigi's Mansion is a brilliant little time waster, and Wave Race Blue Storm was an excellent follow-up to Wave Race 64. But with Super Monkey Ball, there's been a breach! Sega was finally willing to partner up with Nintendo after all of their constant bickering, and their games certainly feel at home on the GameCube, especially in the case of Super Monkey Ball. And just 2 weeks after, both Pikmin and Super Smash Bros. Melee cemented themselves as icons in Nintendo's catalog. And that brings me to what the GameCube was so good at. Having games. If you were a Nintendo fan during this era, you had so many games to choose from. You had games like Animal Crossing, Mario Party 4, 5, 6, and 7, Mario Kart Double Dash, Super Mario Sunshine, Chibi Robo, Wind Waker, Mario Power Tennis, Kirby Air Ride, F-Zero GX, Paper Mario The Thousand Year Door, Metroid Prime 1 and 2, Mario Golf Toadstool Tour, Pikmin 2, Super Mario Strikers, Twilight Princess, Donkey Kong Jungle Beat, Eternal Darkness, and Wario World. All of these games made it so that any Nintendo fan would be more than satisfied with their libraries. The GameCube also made it so that if you weren't a Nintendo fan, you had no idea what was going on. While the GameCube had more than serviceable first-party support, its third-party support was not that. The third-party games on the GameCube consisted mostly of licensed kids games, and the console rarely saw a fraction of the support that others were getting. This is not only because of the GameCube's audience skewing towards the younger side, but also because Nintendo doesn't know why they fail in the first place. Some companies were willing to pull out their sympathies, like Capcom with the Resident Evil series and Sega with everything Sonic related. But that couldn't change the fact that the PS2 was simply destined to be more popular. The GameCube struggled to find relevancy after its launch, while the PS2 never never lost its traction. The PS2 was a console made for everyone. The GameCube, while being a more standard Nintendo console, with almost everything you could ask for as a fan of its franchises, had its own stupid twists that made it look goofy to more hardcore gamers. But it can also be argued that the GameCube wasn't stupid enough, as Nintendo may have tried too hard to directly compete with Sony to the point where they forgot why they ever succeeded in the first place, which was through the innovation of their hardware and software, as well as their manipulation over such a large portion of the video game market. Nintendo simply didn't have the same presence that they used to, and the sales of the GameCube only proved to be a sad reminder of that fact.
Could you stop mourning for 1 second and talk about what really matters here?
I didn't know you wanted me to talk about Wario. Microsoft was beginning to see console gaming as a threat to the entertainment that personal computers provided, and if they couldn't sneak a Windows XP into your living room, they would do everything in their power to at the very least get an Xbox in there. I sit proudly next to my Wii U just to say that Microsoft hasn't been able to hunt me down yet. The Xbox had a similar history to that of the GameCube, with not only its successful launch, but also its drastic fall. The Xbox had better third-party support than Nintendo, mostly because the discs weren't fun-sized, but that didn't prevent the PS2 from hogging up many of the important third-party franchises like Final Fantasy. And even though Microsoft had been around for a while, the Xbox brand itself had nowhere near as much staying power as Nintendo, and especially Sony, with many of its key franchises just getting started. While the Xbox was able to surpass the GameCube in sales because it wasn't the GameCube, it was still in a distant second place. It was a decent first attempt at a home console, and it was clear that the brand held some importance in the gaming space, but not nearly enough to topple Sony. The 6th generation is perhaps one of the most important in all of gaming. It marked the end of one era, as well as the beginning of another. Nintendo was beginning to show their weakness and inability to adapt in certain situations, while Sony was able to easily coast along and reap the benefits for simply being themselves. It showed that no matter how well you were doing at one point or another, complications could always set in and absolutely ruin a console's chances at being profitable. But neither Nintendo nor Microsoft were going to sit back and let Sony keep their dominance for much longer, and so the Antichrist was born. Even though the PS3 and Xbox 360 released before the Wii set those consoles down the paths they ended up on. If the Wii had never done what it ended up doing, both the Xbox 360 and PS3 would have met far different fates. While I would say that the 6th generation had the most stuff going on in terms of being an all-out console war, the 7th generation is perhaps the most interesting. All of these consoles feel so connected to each other despite being completely different, and nowhere is that more apparent than with the Wii. Nintendo's strategy of making incredible games that all Nintendo fans would love didn't go all too well for them last time, so something had to change. And just like that, Nintendo got an idea. Can't say it didn't work out for them. Nintendo's strategy towards winning this generation was revolutionary for the time. The Wii expanded the console market to not only people susceptible to purchasing every re-release of the original Super Mario Bros., but also to your parents. Dad. Not you too. The Wii accomplished this through clever advertisements that posed the console as a perfect system for the whole family, as well as its capacity for motion-based pleasure. I mean, just think of all the possibilities. The motion controls of the Wii Remote allowed for many experiences on the system to be geared towards casual audiences. You didn't have to figure out what all of these buttons meant in order to play golf. All you truly needed was common sense. The Wii's launch will go down in history as one of the most hectic launches for any system. Just about everyone wanted to get their hands on one, and that led to no one getting their hands on one. The Wii was notoriously hard to find for those first few years, which made it even more enticing for people who didn't know better. And the beauty of it was that the Wii didn't even have to try and compete with either the Xbox 360 or the PS3. For a while, it was in a market that belonged entirely to itself. But with that, there were certainly some drawbacks that the system had that would end up damaging Nintendo in the long run. First of all, this console was not made for the hardcore Nintendo fans like with the GameCube. While Nintendo would release some absolutely incredible experiences from time to time, even some of their larger titles were bogged down by the motion controls. And this controller certainly didn't leave that many options available for sensible control schemes. And most of the time, Nintendo wouldn't release games for their loyal fans. Instead, Nintendo would say, "What do you need a new F-Zero for? Wii Music's right over there." But that doesn't even account for the Wii's third-party offerings. Oh, I'm sorry. Did I say offerings? I meant to say blood sacrifices. The amount of garbage on this system left a bad taste in the mouths of consumers, as many of them poorly took advantage of the Wii's motion controls and dignity. And while someone that's more knowledgeable about the projects that Nintendo actually put their effort into this generation would love the system for those experiences, it was hard to ignore the spreading blandness and pandering of Nintendo's titles. This did initially keep those that weren't die-hard Nintendo fans hooked, but even then, people began to grow tired of the horrid quality of many third-party games, while also not caring enough to acknowledge the quality content that was on the system. While the Wii sold incredibly well from its launch in 2006 all the way up to 2010, the sales of the system started to take a hit as Microsoft and Sony tried to get their own share of the motion control market. After all of the rush and adrenaline of the Wii's launch, it was becoming apparent that it was truly nothing more than a fad. Many people didn't buy a Wii because they had genuine love for Nintendo and the quality of games that they would have on offer. They bought it because Wii Sports looked like a fun time. The Wii was the thing to buy for a few years, but because the Wii never satisfied people who were seriously interested in video games, the Wii wasn't able to keep on selling consistently after it moved out of the public consciousness. The Wii may have sold a total of 101.6 million units, which is incredible given the place Nintendo was put in by Sony during the past two generations, but it came at the cost of losing the respect of the gaming community, who saw the console as not only underpowered when compared to the competition, but also as a complete gimmick. And that leads us to the real war of this generation, the Xbox 360 versus the PlayStation 3. What are you doing?
Bracing for impact.
The PS3 and Xbox 360 were polar opposites of each other throughout the entire generation, having each other's strengths as their weaknesses and weaknesses as strengths. Neither console really fought back against the other like with the Genesis and SNES, which is probably for the best. I still haven't recovered from that. The Xbox 360 was revealed to the world in the middle of 2005, and it was looking to scare the pants right off of Sony. With their pants mostly still on, Sony soon after revealed the PS3 was an even bigger deal, making it out to be the ultimate video game device. It took advantage of what was known as the cell processor, displaying some neat looking graphics for the time. But that didn't stop the Xbox 360 from releasing a year before the PS3 by using the power of spite and critical thinking. So by the time the PS3 was released in the holiday of 2006, the Xbox 360 would have already accumulated a decent library. But Sony had gotten such a big head after the PS1 and PS2 became the best-selling consoles of all time that I don't think the prospect of the Xbox 360 beating them out in unit sales because of a head start even crossed their minds. As far as Sony was concerned, the PS3 could have released 84 years from now and it would still beat out the sales of the Xbox 360. So you could imagine their surprise when they announced that the PS3 would cost $1 gajillion and the games on offer were far less interesting than Microsoft's, and somehow no one found it very amusing. Well, except for Microsoft. E3 2006 did not go down well for Sony. The games they showed were boring, the dialogue surrounding everything was strange and awkward, and the price of the PS3 wasn't entirely affordable. And the fact that Sony didn't see much of a problem with any of that, it's unfortunate to say the least. The Xbox 360 had a fair price and so many games that had already released and were on their way. And so, when the time came for the PS3 to launch, Sony's pants were finally knocked off. The PS3 struggled to sell for quite a few years after its launch, and how Sony didn't see this one coming was beyond me. The advertisements were weird and creepy, there were very few compelling first-party exclusives, and it was very overpriced. Much of the junk that was crammed into the PS3 wasn't even necessary, they just did it just because. And that fancy-looking cell processor doohickey, which was supposed to revolutionize the very fact that games could have good graphics, did nothing but cause trouble. Nobody knew how to make games for it because of its foreign architecture, so every third party just decided to make games for the 360 instead. It was more popular, it had a good amount of console exclusives, and developers could actually make games for it. Now that isn't to say the Xbox 360 had a perfect track record, but given all the advantages that the Xbox 360 had, and especially all of the disadvantages that the PS3 had, none of that really mattered in the end. Neither console was going to catch up with the Wii because of its own funny quirks, but it was clear that the PS3 had already lost everything, and it was going to have a very hard time regaining the trust of the community again.
Even though it is embarrassing to lose to that, it's nice to know about the Xbox was able to get one up on Sony. What are these?
Tissues. The Xbox 360 kept releasing hit after hit until the big one, Halo 3. While I personally don't have any experience with Halo 3 or any other games in the franchise for that matter, even I know that this was a big deal. The only problem Microsoft's gonna have now is trying to top a release like that. But you know what? Microsoft found a very simple solution to that problem. Don't. After Halo 3, the Xbox 360 kind of gave up on having a healthy future and decided that it was content where it was at, knowing that it would be nigh impossible for the PS3 to turn things around. Ever read Tortoise and the Hare? Ever since its launch, Sony had been trying to make up for the lackluster reception of the PS3. This led to not only more console exclusives, but also price cuts, and even a redesign that fixed many of the problems that the PS3 once had. All the while Microsoft was trying to get into the same market that Nintendo was profiting from with its Me-like avatars and streaming services. And while both companies decided to delve into motion control devices with the PlayStation Move and the Kinect, Microsoft went into it a bit too hard. When the Kinect turned out to be a success, Microsoft shifted the entire focus of the Xbox 360 into being an all-in-one casual gaming experience, which is nothing but embarrassing to look back on. Even though Nintendo had been profiting from similar strategies, you might remember something along the lines of, oh wait, it was just a fad. So while Microsoft was leading themselves down a dead end full of laziness and desperation, Sony kept on doing what they were doing. And then, just a few months before the launch of the next PlayStation console, The Last of Us released as a PS3 exclusive, and it received glowing reviews, becoming one of the most critically acclaimed games of all time. And that was enough to get another few million people to buy PS3s. So when it was all over with and the sales charts came in, after the Xbox 360 appeared to be untouchable for such a long time, in the end, the PS3 was able to beat it out by just a few million units. There are quite a number of lessons to be learned from this generation of consoles alone. The Wii started out incredibly, but it grew too comfortable with pleasing an audience that was never going to stick around for all that long, and it fell off the radar because of it. The Xbox 360 started out being the console for hardcore gamers, but it grew too lazy and greedy when it also wanted to make some money off of the casual crowd, mostly because it worked for Nintendo. And even with how arrogant Sony started in the generation, the PS3 ended up turning things around by pleasing the hardcore audience by gaining their respect back through incredible console exclusives. Every console here had a key role to play in the overarching console wars, without everything resorting to all-out bickering and trash talk like with the 4th and 5th generations. If you ask me, I think that this generation is where the console wars hit its highest peak in quality. The Wii was a massive success for Nintendo, especially after two consoles that were crucified by the competition. But I would say that it wasn't a very healthy success. Sure, people bought the Wii, but not many people truly played the Wii. Only a fraction of the people who bought the system thoroughly enjoyed its library, and most often stopped caring about it quickly after purchasing it. The Wii didn't bring all too many true Nintendo fans out into the world. Where I saw Christ, other people saw a gimmick. So when Nintendo noticed that interest in the Wii was going down, they got to work on their next console. Rumors floated around for a good bit of time under the codename Project Cafe. This all led up to the announcement of their console during E3 2011. Even though Nintendo had grown a bit out of touch with the gaming community, it was looking like this would be a very important console.
You're gonna need these a lot more than I am.
The Wii U was announced at E3 2011 to a resounding whimper. This was a very confusing reveal for the console, because first of all, the name was a bit funky, but even though people did complain about the name, saying that it was the only problem with the reveal would be a disservice to people with opinions. The main base of this conference wasn't the console itself, but instead its controller. The console was only shown as secondary to the Wii U gamepad. I mean, the controller is automatically what my mind jumps to when I think about the Wii U, but this created an unfortunate problem for Nintendo. The Wii had so many accessories and devices that could be used along with the Wii remote. Most would say too many, but I'll stand by my decision on buying a gold Wii wheel. The Wii U looked like just another accessory for the Wii, and what made it worse was that the Wii U itself looked nearly identical to a Wii. Ask anyone on the street what this is, and 9 times out of 10, they'll tell me to stop harassing them or they'll call the police. But in the case of the other 1 time out of 10, they'll just tell you it's a Wii. Despite such a large gimmick being placed on the console, the controller wasn't exactly justified by the games shown. system. Unlike with what the Wii did for being simple and enjoyable through its gimmick, this left more questions than answers. And even a year later at E3 2012, it still wasn't looking all too great. Nintendo had to re-reveal the Wii U just because people didn't get it the first time. And the new games shown, Pikmin 3, New Super Mario Bros. U, Wii Fit U, and Nintendo Land, weren't exciting in the slightest, or at least not to anyone who wouldn't kill a man for another first-party Nintendo game. I really hope Wario Land 6 is worth it. And once the Wii U finally launched, it was already obvious that Nintendo had failed to capture any attention that wasn't already there before. The Wii U sold pitifully at launch, and throughout its life. There was never a game to release that renewed interest in the system. Games like Mario Kart 8 and Super Mario 3D World kept the system alive, but just barely. And the mediocre quality of games that released in 2015 and 2016 took their toll on the system even further. All the while, people waited for Nintendo's next console to come soon and fast. Now, the Wii U does have its fans, I should know, but even then, I'm willing to admit that this is one of Nintendo's most divisive consoles. Notice how I didn't say the most? Which is why the Wii U selling only 13.6 million shouldn't come as a surprise. This is Nintendo's lowest selling console, and though they had plenty of money to keep them going, if they didn't turn things around soon enough, it could have led to Nintendo embracing the tradition of death that Sega had left behind. Like with the PS3 and Xbox 360, the PS4 and Xbox One go hand in hand during this generation. The stories of these consoles pick up right where their predecessors left off, for better and for worse. Microsoft was still foaming at the mouth to get their hands on the casual market, and so they took the plunge, announcing that their next console required the Kinect to work, streaming was really cool, and and who doesn't love sports? Even as a giddy Nintendo fan, this reveal hurts to watch. Many sane people called out Microsoft for being delusional and lost faith in the brand. Like with the Wii U, the launch of the system decimated the console's chances of ever being number one in that generation. Well, that was a bust. Let's see how Sony's doing. Thank God. It's normal. The PS4 didn't do anything revolutionary or groundbreaking outside of being the only kid on the block who wasn't busy trying to eat his own left toe. Sony announced that the PS4 wouldn't be pulling any of the garbage that was abundant in the Xbox One reveal, and that the system was both more powerful and costed $100 less. With that being said, why would you buy one of these? Oh god. Well, in defense of the Xbox One, it turned itself around slightly, getting rid of some of the stuff that they announced at the system's reveal, while also showing off some decent launch titles at E3 2013, which were arguably better than Sony's offerings at E3 2013. But by this point, it was already too late. It did more legwork to turn things around compared to the Wii U, but Sony was already ahead in pre-orders by the time Microsoft was begging for forgiveness. The launches of both systems were a week apart from each other, and the PS4, while lacking in many compelling exclusives, was really the only choice for many. The Xbox One was too unreliable given Microsoft's track record, and the Wii U was funny. And as time marched onward, the PS4 proved how it was far more capable than the competition through its exclusives alone. Even as someone who would live and die by my Nintendo consoles, the PS4 gives me more than enough reasons to convert. The GameCube's still going in my coffin though. It also had all of the major third parties on its side, because it definitely wasn't the Xbox One or Wii U. Anything that was exclusive to the Xbox One was usually either available on PC or eventually appeared on other consoles as well. And that isn't even saying they're good exclusives. You got the usual Xbox schlock like Halo, Gears of War, and Forza. There wasn't really much to write home about. The main reasons why you would buy an Xbox One was for the Xbox Game Pass, which was a great deal on a whole lot of games, the backwards compatibility that was offered much later into the system's life, and because you wanted to play online with friends who already owned Xboxes, which I've seen happen an unexpected number of times. The PS4 didn't have backwards compatibility, and the later revisions of the Xbox One were more affordable and powerful. But just as Microsoft was trying to turn their situation around given the mistakes they made in the 360 era, the PS4 became irresistible to the public eye. But there were still millions of devoted Xbox fans out there who were willing to splurge on the system even with all of its downsides. The Xbox One sold a modest 51 million units, which is quite good coming from where it started out. But the PS4 still sold 117.2 million units, and lasted so long that it has nearly lasted 10 years without being discontinued, which is certainly respectable. I respect both of these consoles, and they certainly fought against each other quite well, having their own strengths over each other that would certainly get you to prefer one over the other, and not the Wii U.
So who won during this generation?
Nintendo. The Nintendo Switch released as a part of the 8th generation of consoles. Anyone else find that weird? The console released a good 5 years after the generation started with the Wii U, and it's looking like it'll be overlapping with the 9th generation of consoles for quite a while. It doesn't even feel fair to put these consoles in the same competition as the Switch, because while it is true that it was directly competing with the PS4 and Xbox One, those consoles were already in their waning years by the time the Switch released in 2017. I guess I had never thought of it before, because I always think of the 8th generation's console war surrounding the popularity contest between the Xbox One and PS4, while the Wii U struggled to receive any news that wasn't about how it was drastically underperforming, when the biggest console of the generation released at what should have been the end of the generation. But with that gripe out of the way, it makes sense why Nintendo would make another console so soon after the Wii U. The Wii U wasn't doing Nintendo any favors financially, because Game & Wario didn't seem to catch on.
You've been diagnosed with mediocre game-itis.
I didn't know it was contagious. And like with the Sega Saturn, the best decision was to kill it off before any more damage to the company occurred. So just 3 years after the console's release, there was already talk of Nintendo's next console, which went under the codename NX. And for a while there, it turned into a waiting game. Rumors were brought up that the console would have detachable controllers, allowing it to be played both at home on the TV, as well as portably. Even at E3 2016, the console wasn't announced out of Nintendo's fear that the competition would go on and copy their homework before the console was ever released. But after waiting for more than a year after the console's teased announcement, the Nintendo Switch was officially announced. And with that, the room was divided. The trailer had a mixed reception, mostly because of how the Wii U caused such a stink. Many feared that Nintendo wasn't going to address any of the problems that the Wii U had, leading to the Switch falling upon the same fate. But many were also optimistic, given Nintendo's pledge to try and advertise their games this time. The advertisements for the Wii U were not only a joke, but also didn't get people to understand what a Wii U was, or why the Wii U was. The Nintendo Switch advertisements were very quick and to the point, showing what the system's gimmick was while luring in audiences with its enticing games. The Nintendo Switch presentation in January 2017 revealed so many crucial games and trailers that both impressed longtime fans while also spreading the word to new ones. This presentation marked the point in my life when I became a Nintendo fan. I had a Wii U, Wii, DS, 3DS, and GBA at the time, but I never had much of a retrospective on any of them. I don't remember how I stumbled upon the presentation in the first place, but I watched it over and over again, falling in love with the system's gimmick and slew of games. The launch of the system was looking more and more optimistic as it approached March 3rd, and when it launched, it did extremely well. The Switch was hard to find for a while because of how well it was doing. While I was able to snag one luckily at a Walmart very soon after the launch of the system, others weren't so lucky. The Switch succeeded because of its advertising, innovative gimmicks, and an impressive library of games. Any system that has Miitopia automatically gets a pass from me. I might be getting a bit ahead of myself, but this might be one of the greatest consoles of all time. Unlike the Wii, which was carried by a gimmick that appealed far too hard to an audience that never should have mattered, the Switch's gimmick was appealing to everyone, while also satisfying Nintendo fans with an overload of games in all of their franchises. This felt like an era of innovation for Nintendo, who had finally learned how to sell and advertise their games, while pumping out masterpieces every other weekend. The GameCube might still be my favorite Nintendo console, but the Switch is on par with the amount of franchises they utilize and how well they utilize them. And because of how consistently good the content for the Switch has been, the system has been able to sell 129.5 million units as of June 30th, 2023. The Switch was a risky move, but it certainly worked in their favor, as the Switch is now on the rise to becoming one of, if not the best-selling system of all time. All of the other consoles from early in the generation tried, mostly. But nonetheless, the Nintendo Switch stood as a testament to Nintendo's ability to adapt, even after catastrophic failure. For as not far as we are into the 9th generation, I'm still going to at the very least mention it so that I can go to bed tonight with a clear conscience. It didn't work. The PS5 and Xbox Series X are the two consoles that are released in this generation, or at least so far. And personally, I don't find either of them to be all that interesting. They feel like the latest endeavors of Microsoft and Sony, and not much more than that. People went crazy at the launch of both systems though, and with their expensive prices, this just made the systems more successful, particularly with the PS5. But these consoles are honestly just power boxes to me, because while both of them display some truly groundbreaking graphics, neither of them are all all too enthusiastic about their game libraries. I will say that the PS5 has better exclusives at the moment, which is probably the reason that it's currently doing better than the Series X. If there's any one problem that I can identify with the Series X right out the gate, it's just that it lacks a lot of personality and pizzazz. The PS5 looks futuristic and cool, while the Series X just looks like a tall Xbox One. And its game library certainly doesn't help matters. But on the topic of both consoles, I barely hear anyone ever talk about them. I know people who own these consoles, but I don't often find them speaking passionately about it on any occasions. But despite that, both systems are selling quite well, reaching incredible numbers so soon into their lives. I feel like this is mostly due to them being the only real choices if you aren't a Nintendo fan, or someone who would think about buying their consoles because they're usually underpowered and geared towards kids. Speaking of which, where is Nintendo? They're bound to release a console in the 9th generation in some way, shape, or form, and yet we haven't seen anything of them so far, outside of the rumors that place some mystery console as something that we'll only have to worry about next year. But even if Nintendo doesn't release a new console anytime soon, they're doing just fine with what they've got right now. The Nintendo Switch is pulling them along just fine, and it's something that doesn't have any competition given its unique nature. It is true that the existence of the 9th generation consoles have stopped a few people from buying Switches out of a lust for higher graphical power, but I don't think it's enough of an issue to jump the gun and release the next Nintendo system out of fearing the competition. Though it does make me look back on the previous console wars with a whole new appreciation. The constant bickering was annoying, yeah, but it made those early days of consoles so enjoyable to look back on. Yes, I hate Sega for its psychological warfare. Yes, it is disappointing every time Nintendo makes a fatal mistake that costs them the generation, but the rises and falls that each company made while trying to bring each other down in the process always gave you someone to root for. It's like watching a very slow sports match. It can sometimes be a close call, or one console could be a runaway success. And everyone has their own opinions when it comes to which consoles they prefer. And even if you disagree with them, each person often feels the way they do about a certain company's consoles due to an emotional connection of sorts. But it's also because every console has something about it that can be remembered fondly. Even if someone thought that the Wii U was the greatest system of all time, a case can still be made for them through the polished Wii U interface and stellar game library. Okay, maybe not. Everyone is entitled to their own opinions on the console wars. It is a war after all. Sometimes it isn't all about how many units a console sold, it's also about how many passionate gamers the system created. If it wasn't for the rampant debates and scuffling to prove one console is superior to another, I don't think as many people would be as invested in the gaming landscape as they are. As much of a Nintendo nerd as I am, I have more than enough respect for the consoles that fight against it. While it can be fun to argue and protect the systems that you love with all of your heart, listening to why others protect the systems they love with all of their hearts is just as enjoyable. It's a hobby I love, and it never gets old. While I may carry this tattoo around with me for all of eternity, I will never not find enjoyment in exploring the gaming discourse and finding value in even the weakest of opinions. Unless you're wrong.
Did you hear something?
There is a hint of desperation in the air. No, watch out!
I have come to avenge the reception of the electro tennis and smite those who oppose its ideals.
Wait! Can we do this outside? I really don't want to do this in the same room as that. We can't defeat him. His resentment of electro tennis is heightening his abilities in combat.
We can try some new tactics if we really...
You know, I could forget this all happened if you swear your allegiance to the Electro Tennis Empire.
I will never give up my right to express my love for Metopia, and I will certainly never surrender to the cowardice of a first-generation Pong console.
You will die with nothing but your large ego intact.
Ah! You're no match for the strength of Nintendo's home consoles.
Even so, you won't be able to comprehend the power of my final stand. Let me show you the power of the Ultra Electric Tennis!
God, that was annoying.
I thought you died.
I had Madden 21 to protect me.
At least that's over with.
About that.
What? Do you have an opinion too?
I had to watch as Nintendo won through innovation and manipulation, as Microsoft always settled for second place.
Look, if there's anything I've learned today, so you can't go around having a grudge against other consoles and the people that like them. Accepting their opinions is just something that you have to get used to, even if they are wrong.
Then you'll have to get used to your defeat at my hands, because I am right.
Metopia! Ah!
Your failure will be held at the grasp of the Xbox's superior graphical capabilities.
No! Fine then. You asked for it.
Ah! This game's just alright.
I agree.
Yeah.